Well, folks, we're going to continue on today with our study in James. We're at James 5, 1 through 6 today. And the question is, are you rich or poor? You know, James has a very different viewpoint from one taken by the world and even a lot of Christians. He told people to grieve and mourn instead of laughing. That's in verse 9. Here he says that the rich, instead of living it up and rejoicing in their wealth, should actually weep and wail because of the misery coming to them. One of the themes of James 5 is trouble. We meet poor people who are suffering materially because they've been deprived of their wages. We meet people who are physically afflicted, and we meet people who are spiritually backslidden. A second theme in James 5 is prayer. The poor laborers cry out to God. The sick and afflicted are told to pray. Elijah is given as an example of a man who prayed and received answers. When we put these two themes together, we come up with the fifth mark of a mature Christian. He is prayerful in troubles. Instead of giving up when troubles come, the mature believer turns to God, praying and believing that he will help. Now, in this section on riches, it's important to notice that James didn't write that it's a sin to be rich. Abraham was a wealthy man, but he walked with God and was greatly used by God to bless the whole world. Two examples come closer to our time were the very wealthy businessmen J.C. Penney and R.A. Letourneau. They developed businesses that made them very rich, but you know what? They used close to 90% of their earnings instead of 10% to support God's work around the world. James was concerned about the selfishness of most rich people and advised them to weep and wail. He gave three reasons for writing this. Now let's look at this. Let's read our passage first, James 5, 1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming to you. Your wealth is rotted, and the moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fatted yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Well, there's a way that the rich got their wealth. We're responsible for two things regarding finances: how we get our money and how we spend it. James wrote that the rich should fear God's judgment because of the ways that they got their wealth. The Bible doesn't discourage the acquiring of wealth. The Jews in the Promised Land owned their own property, worked it, and gained profit from it. In some of his parables, Jesus showed his respect for personal property and private gain. What the Bible does condemn, however, is getting rich by using crooked ways to get money and by using money for crooked purposes. The prophets Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah expose the selfishness of the rich and their tendency to rob the poor. They warned that judgment was coming. James joins them in that warning. James gives two illustrations of how the rich gained their wealth. These are still true in some places today. He wrote that the rich made their money by holding back wages. Laborers were hired by the day and did not have legal contracts with their employers. And in the law, God had given definite instructions concerning the laboring man to protect him from an unfair and oppressive employer. And we look at that in Deuteronomy 24, 14 through 15. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them for their wages each day before sunset, because they're poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Also in Leviticus 19:13, do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. And Jeremiah 22:13, woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, making his own people work for nothing, not paying them for their labor. These rich men had hired the laborers and promised to pay them a specific amount. The men had completed their work but had not been paid. The verb kept back in Greek indicates that the laborers never will get their salaries. Thou shalt not steal is still a law of God. It's a law he will enforce. As Christians, we must be faithful to keep our promises and pay our bills. Here's an illustration. A doctor met his friend who was a Christian and he asked, how are things going? The doctor answered, I guess okay. The friend told him that he was praying for him. The doctor answered, pray for all the people who owe me money that they will pay. James wrote that another way the rich made money was by controlling the courts. You know, it's often true that those who have wealth also have political power and get what they want. An illustration is there was a cartoon in a paper. One person asked, what is the golden rule? And the other answered, whoever has the gold makes the rules. James 2:6 says this, but you have dishonored the poor. It's not the rich who are exploiting. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Whenever the name Watergate is mentioned, nobody thinks of a beautiful hotel. The word reminds of an ugly episode in American history that led to the discovery of lies and cover-up and ended with the resignation of President Nixon. When God established Israel and her land, he gave the people a system of courts. He warned the judges not to be greedy. They were not to be partial to the rich or poor. Leviticus 19:15, do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Bribery was condemned by the Lord. Amos denounced the judges in his day who took bribes and fixed cases for money. Amos 5:12 and 15 says this, for I know how many are your offenses and how great your sins. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes and deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Verse 15, hate evil, love good. Maintain justice in the courts. Perhaps the Lord God Almighty will have mercy on the remnant of Joseph. Might be good for some of these people prosecuting Trump to read that. Evidently, the courts in James' day were easy to control if you had enough money. As today, poor workers could not afford expensive lawsuits, so they were beaten down every time. The workers had the just cause, but they were not given justice. They were mistreated and abused. The poor man didn't resist the rich because he had no weapons with which to fight. All he could do was call on God for justice. The Bible warns us against gaining wealth by illegal or wrong methods. We may not be rich, but we are faithful in small ways not to steal from others. Are we? God owns all the wealth and he permits us to be stewards of his wealth for his glory. We must put God first in our lives and he will provide us with what we need. Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. It's bad to gain money in a wrong way, but to use money you gain in a wrong way makes the sin greater. How did they misuse their money? Well, first they stored it up. Of course, there's nothing wrong with saving. I mean, First Timothy 5:8 says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. But it's wrong to store up money for yourself that's owed to your employees. These rich men were hoarding grain, gold, and clothing. Instead of laying up treasures in heaven by using their money for God's glory, they were selfishly guarding it for their own security and pleasure. 10 years after James wrote this, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and all this accumulated wealth was taken. What did Jesus mean about laying up treasures in heaven? Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He told the rich young ruler to sell all and give it to the poor. But that was because Jesus knew that his riches stood between him and following Christ. To lay up treasures in heaven means to use all that we have as stewards of God's wealth. God is the owner of everything, and we are only his stewards. What a tragedy it is to see people heap up treasures for the last days instead of laying up treasures in heaven. The Bible does not discourage saving or investing, but it does condemn hoarding money instead of using it for God's work. We must use our money to bless the widows, orphans, and those in need. Those people hoarding money in the last days will probably, when probably many will be suffering and dying. That's not a good thing. Secondly, the rich kept others from benefiting from their wealth. The rich robbed the poor. They refused to pay their salaries so that they could take care of their families. Since we're stewards of God's wealth, we have responsibilities to our master. We must be faithful to use what he gives us for the good of others and the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 4:2. Now it's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Joseph was a faithful steward in Potiphar's house. Potiphar prospered and God was glorified. Thirdly, the rich lived in luxury. Luxury is waste, and waste is sin. Here's an illustration. A magazine ad told of an oil-rich sultan who went on a shopping spree. He bought 19 Cadillacs, one for each of his 19 wives. He also bought 2 Porsches, 6 Mercedes, a $40,000 speedboat, and a truck for hauling it. Besides these, he bought 16 refrigerators and $47,000 in women's luggage, 20 Florida grapefruit trees, 2 reclining chairs, and a slot machine. The bill was $1,500,000 plus $194,000 to have it delivered. Well, what a waste. We are all grateful for the good things in life. It'd be difficult to live in primitive conditions as the missionaries have to. A Quaker said, tell me what you need and I'll tell you how to get along without it. Luke 12:15. Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. I think a lot of Americans need to read that verse. These rich men were feeding themselves on their riches and starving to death spiritually. In Greek, it pictures cattle being fattened for the slaughter. There's a great difference between enjoying what God has given us and living extravagantly on what we have withheld from others. Even if what we have has been earned lawfully and in the will of God, we must not waste it on selfish living. Luxury has a way of ruining character. The rich man in Luke 16:19 through 31 would have fit right in with these rich men, but he'd ended up in the fires of Hades. So, what will happen to their riches? The rich men thought they had it made, but James describes the consequences of misusing riches. First of all, riches will vanish, grain will rot, gold will rust, and clothes will wear out. Nothing material in this world will last forever. The seeds of death and decay are in everything earthly. It's a mistake to think that there is security in wealth. 1 Timothy 16:17, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Riches are uncertain. Prices go up and down, and the stock market fluctuates. Actually, gold doesn't rust like iron does, but the idea is the same. Gold sometimes loses its value. We need to remember that life is brief and we can't take our money with us. Then we see how foolish it is to live for the things of this world. Luke 12:20. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you will get what you have prepared for yourself. Secondly, misused riches will corrode your character, just like salt water corrodes metal. James says that the corrosion of riches will eat your flesh like fire. This is a present judgment. The poison of wealth, like gangrene, has infected these rich men, and they are being eaten alive. Of itself, money is not sinful, it's neutral. It's the love of money that is the root of all kinds of evil. 1 Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Thou shalt not covet is the last of the 10 commandments, but coveting someone else's money and things will cause you to break all the other 9. Abraham was a rich man, but he maintained his faith and good character. When Lot became rich, it ruined his character and eventually his family. It's okay to have money in your hand as long as it doesn't get into your heart. Psalm 62:10, do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. Thirdly, misused riches will result in certain judgment. James not only saw the present judgment of their wealth decaying and their character eroding, he saw a future judgment before God when Christ will be the judge. James 5:9. Don't grumble against each other, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. What will be the witnesses that God will call on in the day of judgment? First, their rotten grain, rusted gold, and moth-eaten clothes will bear witness to their selfishness. Secondly, the wages they held back from their employees will testify against them in court. These stolen salaries will cry out to God for justice and judgment. God heard Abel's blood cry out from the ground, and he hears this stolen money cry too. Then the workers will testify against them. These rich men will not be able to bribe the witnesses or the judge in the court of heaven. This judgment is a serious thing. The lost will stand before God at the great white throne judgment. Revelation 20:11 through 15. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose presence the earth and heaven fled, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. And books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things that were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and the death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The saved will stand before Christ at his judgment seat, 2 Corinthians 5, 9 through 10. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive compensation for his deeds done through the body in accordance with what he has done, whether good or bad. God will not judge Christian sins because they've already been judged at the cross and put under the blood, but he will judge our works and our ministry. If we have been faithful, we will receive a reward. If we've been unfaithful, we'll lose our reward. James shows us that misused riches result in the loss of a precious opportunity. We must buy up or make use of our opportunities. Ephesians 5:16, making the most of your time because the days are evil. We must also work while it is day. John 8:4. They said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the very act of committing adultery. You know, think of all the good that could have been accomplished with that selfishly hoarded wealth. It's good to have things that money can buy, provided that you have the things that money can buy. What good is a $500,000 house if it's not really a home for a loving family? What good is $1 million diamond ring if there's no love in giving or receiving it? You know, James didn't condemn riches or rich people. He condemned the wrong use of riches and rich people who use their wealth as a weapon against others instead of a tool to build up others. It is possible to be poor in this world and yet rich in the next world. James 2:5, listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, did God not choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? It's also possible to be rich in this world and poor in the next one. We see this lived out in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The return of Christ will make some people poor and others rich, depending on the spiritual condition of their hearts. What we keep, we lose. What we give to God, we keep, and he adds interest. Although none of us is rich, we must guard against the love of money. Are we jealous of rich people? Is God first in our money, or do we give him the leftovers? Are we generous toward others, or only generous toward ourselves? What we do with our money shows who we love most. Luke 12:21. Such is the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich in his relation to God. So, we need to ask ourselves, am I rich or poor toward God and his work?